Hi everyone, it's Mr. Sinti, and I'd like to welcome you to this video, which is an introduction on anatomy and physiology. That's right, anatomy and physiology, one of the more important, one of the more, I would say, popular courses to take, because it's this particular class that is the stepping stone into many, if not all, health related fields. And so, welcome and thanks for joining me in this conversation. First thing I want to say about it is something kind of obvious, but I wanted to just start with this because I think it's important. We've all been very curious, and I think it's within us to be curious about how our own body works. And one of the things about that is that sometimes our body doesn't work perfectly, and we have aches and pains, and we have injuries. And even if it's not ourselves, it could be family members or friends. And so we've all been curious, and I think this, and again, I'm not an expert in the history of anatomy and physiology, but boy, wouldn't that be a fascinating topic to study and investigate? And I think it's worthwhile to look into that. It sounds pretty cool to me. But we've always been curious and challenged by understanding the body. And you can look back. You can go back to these Rembrandt paintings in the 1600s and look at early anatomists. And again, just to sort of come out of the gate and define this, anatomy, a Greek meaning to cut, to cut up, tomi, anatomy, to cut up organisms. And again, it's also the science of nomenclature in terms of defining the names of morphological or physical structures. And so that's very important so that we know that what we're talking about. And it's more important that we all are using the same language. And so I want to start off with that. But even before the 1600s, I mean, you got to know that it goes far back. And for centuries, that people have been attempting to learn the body's secrets. And I think we can even go back to the time of the Egyptians, to be honest about that. And we can see evidence in their drawings of their understanding of blood vessels. Pretty cool. But I will say this: it's usually when you're most interested about anatomy and you're most interested about physiology, it's when you're either injured or you're trying to help someone else who is injured. And so people count on others who are knowledgeable in the fields of anatomy and physiology. And so I welcome you on this journey, and it's a journey that will never end. I'll say this as well. We can always know more about physiology and how the body works and its function. And so we find that studying the structures are interesting, but they're also a necessity to understand them. And again, as I was saying, anatomy might be the oldest of all medical science. And so that's pretty cool. And so you can, again, and I was having some fun with this, looking up some images here. Here's a dissection in the 15th century. And so look at the look on some of the people's faces. And again, there was also, I was looking into some information about after Roman gladiator fights, some of the individuals that didn't quite survive that. There was big crowds looking at those battles. But what was more interesting was sometimes they took the body and displayed it after the contest, and people were more interested in the internal organs of the body. It's pretty interesting. And so sacrificial victims were then cut open, and we begin to start to use the scientific method to understand what these structures actually do. And so, fast forward to the future, we now have incredible technology that we can peer into the body and actually see. We have x-rays, we have ultrasound. This is an ultrasound image, as you can see here, of a pregnant woman. You can see the uterus and the little embryo inside. And so obviously, this is safe and it's okay for babies, but today we use sophisticated analysis of the body, and it's performed on many instruments. And so we can compare and contrast, what is normal anatomy and what is abnormal anatomy, even when things we can't see. We could use ultrasound, for example, we could use microscopes, etc. And so this is, again, an embryo after 6 weeks in the uterus right there. Pretty cool. Another an example of why anatomy is important is that we can see here, and again, I know that this, you may not have background in this, but over here we see, and I'll sort of point it out, we have lung tissue over here with the light microscope, 440 magnification. The lung is made up of these little air sacs called alveoli, and this is one of them, an alveolus. And it's surrounded by blood vessels, the tiniest of all capillaries, and this is where gas exchange takes place in the lungs. Long story short on this, that these small air sacs have a pretty strong surface area to volume ratio, which makes it a really useful in terms of maximizing diffusion rates. Now, emphysema, a condition that you really do not want to have, and it's caused by smoking amongst other things, breaks down the thin cellular walls of the air sacs, as you can see, which create the larger air sacs, which then creates a less surface area to volume ratio, and the patient has difficulty obtaining oxygen and ridding themselves of carbon dioxide, can be serious and lethal. And so one of the things that I want to say about anatomy right out of the gate is that anatomy is structure. And I said this before, but I'm showing you pictures over here of silverware. So you see a spoon, a fork, and a knife. If you didn't know anything about this flatware, and again, I can reference back to the Disney movie The Little Mermaid, when Ariel thought that a fork was a comb. And it's logical to think that, because again, the spokes right in here are useful to sort of brushing your hair. But the truth is, a fork is by its very structure designed to poke, whereas a spoon is good for scooping. And so I want you to understand that there's a very important relationship between structure and function. The structure dictates and is correlated to the function. And so we often say in anatomy and physiology that form fits function. And so this is a through line no matter what you're studying. And I find it very interesting that you can find this on a gross anatomy level, in other words, structures that you can see with the naked eye, and also microscopically. It's totally fascinating. And so you can see from a molecular level all the way up, and the knowledge of the structure provides insight about how the structure works. And so, for example, take a look at this slide right here. This is the light microscope. I'm not sure if you're familiar with what this is. And so this is a look at tissue of the skin. And so this upper layer of the skin, if you're using anatomy, you would say this is the epidermis. So upon the dermis, which is below. Epi means upon, and dermis. And so the structure, the anatomy, is epidermis. But take a look at this more closely. Do you see that these layers of cells, there's many, many layers of cells, and they're stratified on top of each other, and they're flat. And so the name of this tissue is stratified squamous. Squamous meaning flat or scale-like, like a fish. And so the physiology, which is the study of function, what is the function of this outer layer of tissue? This is the outside up here. Well, the fact that it's very stratified makes it almost impenetrable to germs. And so microorganisms that are trying to get us would have a difficult time here. And it also serves to protect the underlying tissues below. And so the fact that it's stratified makes it a formidable tissue for protection. And if I were to go back just a moment ago, you can see here that this cell layer right here in the alveolar air sac is a single cell layer, and it's very thin. It's sort of like a crepe that forms a ball. And so those cells are simple squamous, and their structure, their anatomy, facilitates their function, which is rapid diffusion, as opposed to protection. And so that's just one example of that. Another example of that, just to drive the point home, you can look at the anatomy of the heart and say over here, look, here's the left ventricle. There's 4 chambers in the human heart. And over here is the left ventricle, and it pumps, what is its function? It pumps blood, oxygenated blood, up here through the biggest artery of the body, which is the aorta, right up here. And you're like, okay, that is the function of the left ventricle, which is pumping oxygenated blood. But when you're talking about anatomy and physiology, A and P, it almost rolls off the tongue as if it's some sort of like a compound noun, meaning that when you're understanding the name of the structure, you're also immediately considering its functionality. Look more closely here at this diagram. Do you notice over here the wall of the heart is muscular? And this muscular area right in here, this myocardium layer, this cardiac muscle tissue, is very thick, which is conducive to pumping very vigorously. And so that makes perfectly good sense that this particular structure is designed for pumping blood to the entire body. And this goes for everything. I can keep going with this, but I try to hold myself back. But you can look at bone of the skull. Very important bone of the skull is this ethmoid bone. And this particular bone, found right up here at the top of the nose, it has this crista galli. This is a point of attachment for the brain. It has this cribriform plate. And what's fascinating here about the anatomy is that it has all these little holes right here. And it's perfect for olfactory epithelial nerve tissue to penetrate from where it's sensing all the way back up into the brain. And so you can also see these sinuses over here that makes the bone a little lighter. So it's a combination of knowing the names of structures and also knowing their function. So anatomy and physiology. And again, we can go down and look at the humerus, which is your upper arm and your lower arm, the ulna and radius. But what we have to consider is that we all have to be using, when I say we, meaning internationally, we all have to be talking about the same structure so there's no confusion in the medical field about what we're talking about. The terms must be mutually understood and there must be a common language. And so there's a long background with this in terms of the names of these structures go back to early Latin, and it still persists, and Greek terminology. And there's actually federations and organizations that assemble and to make sure that internationally we're all talking about the same terms. And so anatomy, I mentioned this before, anatomy could be gross anatomy, not like disgusting, but meaning very large, visible structures. So I don't know if you recognize this, but you would see it with your eye. This is the kidney, and this is your kidney forms urine, and then that travels down the ureter to the urinary bladder. So gross anatomy. At times, you'll want to study the anatomy of things that are very, very small, like in the kidney. Okay, there's the kidney, but how does the kidney work? You're like, well, I'm not sure. Well, it filters the blood. How does it filter the blood? We ask these questions. And so we need to look at these structures real close under the microscope. This particular type of microscope is called a scanning electron microscope. It's one of my favorites because it sees things really close and it's 3D. So this is a ball of capillaries right here. And when the blood comes into these balls of capillary, and the anatomy of this is that it's called a glomerulus, but it's a ball of capillaries. And this is where the fluid in the blood, mainly the plasma, is filtered out of the bloodstream. And so it's pretty cool to consider that some anatomy you need microscopes in order to see. And so, again, that was a scanning electron micrograph of this thing called the glomerulus, the structure. This is also the glomerulus right here. And you're like, really? Doesn't look like it. Well, this is the light microscope. And when blood travels through these blood vessels, the plasma is filtered into this capsule right over here, and it's known as the Bowman's capsule. And again, there's a lot of cool structure in this area called the nephron. And so I want to point out a couple terms, if you don't mind. The study of tissues, which are groups of cells. You see these cells right here that are very similar to one another. Each one, you can see the nucleus as those circular areas. Cells that are common, that look similar and have a similar function, are referred to as tissue. And so a lot of times we'll be looking at tissue in anatomy and physiology. And sometimes we need to look at individual cells to see what's going on. And so the study of tissues, histology, the study of cells, cytology. Cyte meaning cell. So speaking of this tissue and cells, let's talk about the levels of organization that make up the human body. So you may know that all matter is composed of atoms, okay? And atoms that are elements that are composed of the same kind of atom, like for example hydrogen, would be an element, and hydrogen can ally with other elements, like for example, oxygen, to make up a molecule of water. Now there's many kinds of molecules. You can have small ones, like oxygen or carbon dioxide or water, or you can have larger molecules, macromolecules. These are important. Our body's made up of macromolecules. It could be made up of protein, it's a big molecule, carbohydrates, it could be made up of lipids or nucleic acids. But macromolecules form these little tiny structures called organelles that exist inside the cell. This is a picture of a mitochondria. This blue structure down here is the nucleus. And so there's all these little organelles that perform chemical reactions that make the cells work. Now I should point out that the cell is the smallest living unit. So anything below the level of the cell isn't technically alive, but I find that to be interesting too. I find a lot of things to be very interesting, and I hope you do as well, because that's what it's about. If you don't mind me saying that it's the stuff that we don't know well that is interesting, and the stuff that we already know is not that fascinating. And so I find it interesting, no matter how long I've been studying this, and it's been a while, that life emerges, the cell, from the interaction, chemical reactions of non-living things. It's pretty cool. So cell respiration occurs in the mitochondria. Can you see this right here? Do you see how the cell has this cell membrane that's sort of convoluted like this? This is an indication that there'd be more surface area, which then leads us to the function, which this cell is really adapted to diffusion because it has a better surface area. Now this cell makes up, along with others, tissues. And you can see here, we're eventually leading to the stomach, if you don't recognize this. This tissue right here, which makes up the inside of the stomach, is known as epithelial tissue. And so that's a type of tissue. But below that, there's other kinds of tissue. There's muscle, and there's nerve tissue and connective tissue. So groups of tissue, groups of different tissues make up organs. So there's your definition. Different tissues make up an organ. But then organs, though you may know something about a stomach, you may say, well, it digests, and you may know that it digests protein in particular, but it produces acid. You may know these things, but it doesn't work alone. It works with other organs. For example, the liver, and below the stomach is this gland called the pancreas, and then food travels into the small intestine, and then into the large intestine, and into the rectum, and then out the anus. So collectively, when you consider the esophagus, the liver, the stomach, the intestines, all of this is considered to be a system, a group of organs working together with a common function, which is the digestion, the breakdown of food, and also the absorption of food. And so that's how you have it. And at each level, emerging properties, as I was alluding to over here with life, emerging properties manifest. And so a review this, atoms come together to form molecules that work together. You can get complicated things such as proteins, and I'm not sure about your background in this, but you may recognize this as being actin protein, which is found in your muscles. Actin is made up of a group of subunits, two strands, and there's another protein that actually wraps around actin called troponin. And what's interesting, tropomyosin. And then there's this big thick protein right here called myosin that interacts with actin, and the filaments go past each other, and it actually causes the cell to contract. And so again, a cell, this could be a heart cell, and you can see the nucleus here. So cells are made up of molecules, in this case protein, and then atoms. And so when you get a bunch of muscle cells, like back here, when you get a bunch of muscle cells together, you make up muscle tissue. And so there's really generally four kinds of tissues that we can classify them as, one of them being muscle tissue, another one being connective tissue, another one being epithelial and nervous. And I've constructed some videos that discuss each one of those tissues. There's a lot to say about each of them, because you would imagine your body is made up of this. These are the very the fabric, if you will. This is the quilt of the body, the tissues, and how they interact. And so, again, if you get the tissue, like cardiac muscle, which is a type of tissue, a subcategory, makes up the heart, which is an organ. And the reason the heart is an organ is because there's also some connective tissue in the form of adipose, and there's also some nerve involved. And so a collection of different tissues working together makes up an organ. And then it makes up the cardiovascular. In other words, cardio meaning heart, vascular meaning vessels. And then different organ systems, cardiovascular, digestive system, skeletal system, make up the organism, okay, on a macro level like that. And so we have many systems of the body, and they all work together. Very cool. Oftentimes when we approach the study of anatomy and physiology, we move, no pun intended, systematically through the systems. In other words, this is the urinary system, this is the cardiovascular system, but the truth is, where the coolness comes into it, is how they all work together. And that is what maintains the coordination, is how they all kind of work together. And so it's been said that we have 11 organ systems. So some examples of this: the integumentary system, made up of one of the largest organs of the body, the skin. We also have hair and sweat glands and nails. And again, function may be obvious, but protects the body from the environment. And again, it helps to regulate body temperature. The lower levels of the skin have adipose tissue, which is, in other words, of saying a lot of fat, which helps us to insulate. And also the skin has sensory neurons that help us perceive and sense the world and get information from the outside. Of course, I'm not going to go through every system, but I just want to point out a couple of organ systems that are like beyond interesting. They're so fascinating. The skeletal system, not only protecting us, protecting our brain, protecting our spinal cord, protecting our visceral organs in the rib cage, but bone also stores calcium. It also stores fat. It also is the site of blood cell formation. So it does so much. Muscular system, of course, that's associated with movement. We were talking about the heart pumping blood, and it maintains temperature as well, because again, but through the kinetic energy and friction. We can look at the nervous system. Boy, what doesn't the nervous system do? The brain, it's the center of thought. We see with the brain, we smell with the brain, we hear with the brain, we act with the brain. It's everything. Spinal cord, peripheral nerves, sensory organs. Basically, the nervous system detects external and internal stimuli, and then it responds in a variety of ways. It may respond directly, or it could get other systems involved, like, for example, the endocrine system. Maybe the nervous system promotes the release of a hormone, for example. And then the hormone travels, a chemical that travels in the blood and gets the job done. And so all of this services this one and very important unifying concept, which is homeostasis. Homeo meaning same, stasis meaning status. In order to survive, our bodies need to maintain homeostasis. We need a constant body temperature. We need a constant amount of calcium in our bloodstream. When calcium is low, calcium is released from the bones where it's stored. Sometimes bones will be needing calcium. We need to take that in from the outside in the form of food. We're always trying to maintain internal environment, homeostasis. And basically, in a nutshell, all the systems perform in order to maintain homeostasis. And one can say that the cause of death is the breaking of homeostasis. It's like, oh, the person got into a car crash, and sorry for this being a little morbid, their arm is severed, and that is why they died. Now, you can live without your arm. What you cannot live with is when the blood is gushing out and your blood pressure drops, and then things will go wrong. So when homeostasis is interfered with, then it's not good. So systems respond to external and internal changes, and then they function in order to maintain this normal range in terms of fluid balance, uh, temperature balance, sugar balance, glucose levels in the blood. And so we have receptor that receives the stimulus. Then we have a control center. I mean, this may seem obvious, but I feel like it's important to touch on it. A control center that sort of processes the signal and sort of sends instructions out, and then an effector which actually carries the instructions out. For an example, other than the body for a moment, because this is something that we can relate to. Okay, so stimulus. The room temperature it's getting warm. Okay, so it's getting a little hot in the room. Okay, so the normal condition is disturbed. So we have the ability to, we have a thermometer that's sensing, okay, the temperature is rising, it's getting a little too hot. So then that information affects a control center, in other words, a thermostat. And the thermostat is like, okay, then sends a signal to the effector, which is the air conditioner, which then turns on, and then it cools the room. The response is the room temperature then drops, and then we maintain this sort of, the normal condition is restored, and then the room temperature is great. We're reaching homeostasis. So the temperature is constant. Let's say that the temperature is, as you can see here in Celsius, it's around 22 degrees. But the truth is, like, see this chart over here? The truth is it gets a little low, okay? And then it goes up. And then it's a little hot, so the air conditioner comes on. And then it droops down, and it goes up again. So it oscillates. When something's oscillating like that, you can take the average, and it is 22 degrees at sort of a set point. And so, let's relate temperature, if we will, to the body. So same thing. The body temperature is rising. There's receptors that sense temperature in the skin. They relay that information to the control center, which happens to be in the brain, of all things. How about that? So the hypothalamus then sends information out to sweat glands, and we're releasing water. Water from the skin creates evaporative cooling. We have blood vessels that are capable of contracting and dilating. And in this case, if it's getting hot, maybe they dilate, which means that our skin is looking a little flush. And then heat is lost, heat increased, loss from the skin drops body temperature. And again, our body temperature is 37 degrees, not 22. So it's a little warmer than that. And so you can see, again, that oscillation, and it maintains homeostasis, body temperature, 37 degrees. And so this is an example of negative feedback. In other words, when something is a little low, that means that we need to pick it up a little bit. And when something's a little high, we need to slow it down. And so it's a feedback. So it's able to bring the body back into homeostasis, and then normal range is achieved. And it's called negative, if you're wondering about that, because negative means that when it's too high, it shuts down the production of a hormone, if we're talking about that. When the hormone level is high, it shuts off the production of the hormone. So it's referred to as a negative feedback. And when the hormone is low, that stimulates its production. You're like, well, okay, but if that's negative feedback, what does positive feedback mean? Well, we'll address that in a moment. I want to talk about negative feedback just a little bit more and give an example of this. Behind your stomach, we have this gland called the pancreas, and just a little 1, 2, 3 on the pancreas. The pancreas is very cool in that it functions as a gland, but two different kinds of glands. One's called an exocrine gland, and one's an endocrine gland. Exocrine means that it secretes to the outside, like a sweat gland or a salivary gland, or it could mean just to the outside, meaning through a duct into the small intestine. Or it could be endocrine, which means that it's producing a hormone that's going to travel into the bloodstream. So endocrine into the bloodstream. Here's a cut or cross-section, if you will, of the pancreas. And you can see these are the ducts here. You can see that these glands, in other words, groups of cells that secrete, will produce digestive juices, which will then travel down into the pancreas. But do you see these little red islands, if you will? They're referred to as the islets of Langerhans. And so these cells will produce hormones that will travel into this big red guy, which is a blood vessel. And these hormones help to regulate through feedback, negative feedback. They help to maintain homeostasis. And you're like, homeostasis of what? And here's a look at these islands of these particular cells. They maintain the negative feedback of glucose in the body. And so let's take a look at this. I have a little video clip to show you on negative feedback, and I think it's pretty interesting here. And so I lowered the volume down, and there's some narration below, but I'll see if I can do it myself if you don't mind. So here's this guy, and he's eating something sweet, like a popsicle. And the body, when it's consumed, is, let me go back just a second. When you eat simple sugars like this, a disaccharide, the body's going to break it down, and we're here in the stomach. I'm sorry, in the small intestine. And the sugars are broken down. And when the sugars are broken down, they're absorbed by the small intestine and they enter the bloodstream. And then, as you can see, the red blood cells and these green guys are glucose. And the level of glucose rises when we eat something sweet, obviously. And so, in order for homeostasis to take care of the body, we need to lower the blood sugar level. So it's sort of like temperature. It's getting a little warm. Glucose, it's getting a little high. So we want to bring it back down to normal. How's that going to work? And so it's an example of homeostasis in the body. So we're thrown off a little bit by the fact that the glucose level is high in the blood. And so there's a hormone called insulin, you may have heard of it before, that's produced by the pancreas. And in particular, it's produced by these certain cells. There's two kinds of cells in the pancreas. There's A and B, or alpha and beta. It's the beta cells that produce this famous protein hormone called insulin that helps to lower blood sugar level. Let's see how it works. And so the pancreas produces this blood glucose reducing hormone called insulin. And so you can see how the glucose is very high. So molecules are leaving the bloodstream and they're being picked up by these beta cells. This is the cell membrane of a beta cell. And now it's releasing this hormone. That's what this purple is. It's a chemical hormone. And now that is going into the bloodstream. So that's why it's called an endocrine, because it goes in the bloodstream. And so it goes all over the body, but in particular, it has certain target cells. And let me back that up for a second. In particular, insulin is really well received by the liver, and it's also received by the small intestine. And what the liver is going to be doing, spoiler alert, is the insulin is going to tell the liver cells to produce more protein transports to facilitate the uptake of glucose into the liver. So thus lowering glucose levels in the blood. And so you can see here, so here's the hormone, and it's interacting with the membrane proteins on the outside of the liver cell. And then what that's doing is taking in glucose. And the glucose comes into the liver, and it's connected together in these long strands into something called a polysaccharide. And in particular, it's called glycogen. It's how the body stores sugar in the form of a polysaccharide inside the liver, in glycogen. And so by taking the sugar in, it's lowering blood sugar levels. And so, pretty cool example, I think, of negative feedback. And so let me come back here, if you don't mind, to our original slideshow. Let's talk about positive feedback for a moment. So what does this mean? This means that when there's an effector increases, the response is it increases every time the stimulus comes, the body is moved further away from homeostasis. And you're like, what do you mean? Well, the more, the more. And so normal range is lost, but it's used to speed up a process. And you're like, well, I can't even think of an example of that. Let me give you one. Well, inside of our brain, we have this very important hormone, a very important gland called the pituitary gland. You may have heard of it. We have an anterior part of it and a posterior part. Anterior means to the front, posterior means to the back. And the posterior pituitary gland produces a hormone called oxytocin. And this sort of translates to birth. So it's a birthing hormone, which increases labor contractions. Now, labor contractions, as you may know, force babies out of the uterus. And so its target is the uterus. And so the way this works is that when the baby's very large, and we don't actually know this completely, it's not completely understood, but when the baby's very large and is close to full term, it begins pushing on the walls of the uterus. And then that sends nerve impulses up into the brain, which causes a release of the hormone oxytocin. And its job is to cause the uterus to contract. And as the uterus contracts, it then stimulates the posterior pituitary gland to make even more oxytocin, and then more contraction, and then more hormone, and then more contraction, and then more hormone. And so the contractions become more severe and they become longer in duration, ultimately serving the purpose of squeezing a baby out of the female body. And so when I was saying it pushes something away from normal, that means it's just going to keep going and going, and it's going to get more and more and more, and you're like, it'll never end. Well, when the baby's born, that sort of ends it. Actually, that's just the beginning if you've had children. I digress with that. Another example would be if you have a tear in a blood vessel. The damaged tissue surrounding this injury will release chemicals that will bring clotting into effect. And what that will do is it sort of sums platelets that form a plug. I won't get into this. There's some detail to this, but I'll say this, that it starts a chain reaction that causes these cells to sort of produce insoluble protein called fibrin, which then initiates the clotting process. But what I'm getting with this is, as the clot accelerates, it's a positive feedback loop, because like the more chemicals that are released, the clotting continues, and at each step there's even more chemical until ultimately it concludes in the formation of a blood clot. So that's yet another example of this. And so in conclusion, I'll say this, that all the organ systems of the body work together to maintain homeostasis. So that's the take-home message from this video, is that the state of equilibrium is very important. And so there's opposing forces. I mentioned in that little video that there's that hormone insulin that lowers blood sugar and it stores it in the form of glycogen. But what about when we haven't eaten in a long time and we need to raise our blood sugar levels? There's another hormone called glucagon that is also released from the pancreas, and that serves to stimulate the cleaving of glucose from the glycogen, and it raises blood sugar levels. And so it's a process that continues back and forth, back and forth. And so we use this term dynamic, meaning like continually adapting. Temperature goes up, temperature goes down, glucose goes up, glucose goes down, calcium goes up, calcium goes down. So it's the physiological, the functioning of all the systems work to maintain this homeostasis. Failure to achieve that would be disease, and then ultimately death if it's not corrected. And so this is our task, to sort of understand this, to sort of deal with it, to be curious about it, and to figure out how, when people are having difficulty maintaining homeostasis because they have something wrong with a particular hormone, maybe they have diabetes, we can work to help them and make their lives a little bit better. And so I hope that introduction to anatomy and physiology was very interesting. Thanks for watching.